Imagine a country that's growing its economy by 5 to 7% every single year, just year after year for decades.
Right.
Almost everyone has a job. Highways are literally being carved through mountains. Billions of dollars in foreign investment are just pouring in, and extreme poverty is plummeting.
It sounds like an absolute miracle on paper.
It really does. But then, you look a little closer at the numbers and you realize that over 75% of those workers are, well, they're basically one bad flu season or one failed harvest away from absolute financial ruin.
Welcome to our deep dive into the source material.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It is the ultimate paradox of rapid national development, honestly. You have these top-line economic miracles just coexisting right alongside this really profound systemic human vulnerability.
And that is exactly the tension we are exploring today. We've got this massive stack of academic analysis synthesized from the World Bank and multiple global agencies, and it tracks the Lao People's Democratic Republic, or Lao PDR.
Right, and we're looking at a huge timeline here. Exactly, data spanning all the way from 1960 to 2023. And for you listening, I want to be clear, this isn't just some boring ledger of exports and imports.
No, definitely not.
It's a masterclass in how a developing, landlocked nation attempts to modernize at just breakneck speed.
What makes this specific analysis so compelling, I think, is its multidimensional approach.
Yeah.
I mean, we are looking at a society undergoing a complete structural transformation.
Yeah.
We're tracking not just the flow of capital, but, the health of the citizens, the quality of the air they're breathing, and the actual institutional frameworks that govern all of it.
Right. So for you listening, whether you're managing international supply chains or studying developmental economics, or honestly just fascinated by the sheer mechanics of human progress, this data reveals the universal blueprint of rapid growth.
It really does.
It shows us exactly what it takes to pull a nation into the modern global economy, and more importantly, it exposes the hidden, sometimes brutal costs of actually doing so. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the baseline, right?
Yeah, to really grasp the scale of the transformation, we have to look at where they started. If we look back at the historical record from the early 1990s, the economic reality of Lao PDR was incredibly stark. The nominal GDP per capita was hovering around 43 US dollars.
Let me just stop you right there because that number it's almost difficult to process. $43 for an entire year.
Annually.
I mean, we are talking about an agrarian society operating largely on a subsistence level at that point, right?
Completely.
Isolated by mountainous geography and recovering from decades of regional conflict.
Exactly. The country was heavily reliant on traditional agriculture, with very little integration into global markets. But if we fast forward to the 2020s, that nominal GDP per capita has surged past $2,500.
That's just an exponential leap.
It's massive. And it was driven by this remarkably sustained period of annual GDP growth. I mean, they were consistently hitting that 5 to 7% range year over year, right up until the global disruptions of 2020.
Right. The researchers track a really sharp drop in 2020, plunging to around -1%, which, I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah, the pandemic hit everyone.
Supply chains froze, international tourism just halted completely. It proved that no matter how insulated a country might seem, it's inextricably tethered to global headwinds.
Absolutely.
But, I really want to challenge this narrative of the baseline numbers for a second, because that $2,500 nominal GDP figure, it only tells half the story.
Right, the purchasing power.
Exactly. The analysis introduces GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP, and that number is roughly $6,703 for 2022.
That's a crucial distinction. When you evaluate an emerging economy, relying solely on nominal exchange rates can severely distort your understanding of the actual standard of living.
I know anyone who follows global markets probably understands the basic concept of PPP, like adjusting for the local cost of living, but the sheer size of this gap is what really catches my attention.
It's huge.
It's nearly triple the nominal rate. Have you ever visited a country where your money suddenly went 3 times as far? That is the PPP gap in action. But my pushback here is about what this actually means for the country's global leverage.
Okay, how so?
Well, sure, their local purchasing power is strong because domestic agriculture keeps a bowl of noodles cheap, and maybe local labor keeps rent in Vientiane affordable compared to a Western city. But if a hospital in Vientiane needs to buy, say, an MRI machine from Germany,
Right.
or a student needs to buy a new laptop, that PPP advantage just evaporates, right? They are paying global prices with that nominal $2,500 income. Doesn't this massive PCP gap actually highlight a severe vulnerability in their global buying power?
You're absolutely hitting on the core limitation of purchasing power parity. I mean, PPP is excellent for measuring domestic welfare. It tells us that a citizen in Lao PDR can afford housing, local transportation, and food much more easily than a straight currency conversion would suggest.
Because the local economy is self-sustaining in a way?
Yes. The domestic supply chains for basic necessities are highly efficient and insulated from Western inflation. However, your point about the MRI machine is spot on. PPP does not buy imported technology.
Right.
It does not buy high-end pharmaceuticals. It does not pay off foreign debt that's denominated in U.S. dollars.
So the wide gap tells us they've built this resilient local survival economy, but they're still fighting an incredible uphill battle to acquire the capital goods needed to truly modernize.
Precisely. To acquire those capital goods, you need foreign currency, which means you need to produce things the rest of the world actually wants to buy. You need to transition from just growing your own food to industrializing.
Which is a huge jump.
It is, and that structural shift is the most aggressive pivot in the entire historical record we're examining here.
Let's get into the mechanics of that pivot then, because the breakdown of where the wealth is generated completely flips over this 30-year period. In the early 1990s, industry accounted for roughly 13% of the GDP.
Right.
But recently, that has surged to over 30%.
And we should clarify, that industrial leap is not driven by light manufacturing or textile sweatshops, which is, the traditional narrative for developing Asian economies.
The typical garments to electronics pipeline.
Exactly. In Lao PDR, this industrial surge is heavily concentrated in resource extraction, specifically mining and massive electricity generation.
This is where we see the strategy of capitalizing on their geography. I mean, they're a landlocked country, but they have these immense river systems, most notably the Mekong and its tributaries. They essentially branded themselves as
The battery of Southeast Asia?
Right, the battery of Southeast Asia.
Exactly. The strategy was to harness that flowing water to generate hydroelectric power, not just for domestic use, but as a primary export commodity to energy-hungry neighbors like Thailand and Vietnam.
Which makes sense on paper.
It does, but building a billion-dollar megadam requires astronomical upfront capital. A developing nation with a nominal GDP per capita of a few $100s back in the early 2000s simply does not have the domestic savings or the sovereign wealth to finance that.
Which totally explains the massive influx of foreign capital. The historical record shows that since 2010, net foreign direct investment, or FDI, has frequently broken the $1 billion mark annually.
Yeah, the money just flooded in.
Foreign entities are coming in, bringing the engineering expertise and the capital to build the dams and dig the mines.
It is the defining feature of their industrialization.
Yeah.
And alongside that heavy industry, the service sector has been growing at 6 to 7% annually. I mean, before the global mobility freeze in 2019 and 2020, international tourism expenditure reached about $1 billion.
Wow, so tourism was matching the FDI at one point.
Roughly, yeah. They were successfully monetizing their cultural heritage and their natural landscapes.
There's also this fascinating anomaly in the export data I noticed. Around 2015, high-tech exports briefly spiked to about 3% of their total manufactured exports.
Though,
It didn't last, but it shows a flirtation with integrating into higher-value global supply chains, maybe capturing some spillover from tech manufacturing in neighboring countries. But here is the massive structural contradiction I really want to dissect.
okay, let's hear it.
We have this roaring engine of industry mining, dams, FDI driving the GDP up. But when you cross-reference that with the labor force distribution, agriculture still employs a staggeringly large portion of the population.
It does.
If industry is making all the money, why are the workers still out in the fields? Why the disconnect?
Because the type of growth Lao PDR has pursued is deeply asymmetric. What you're observing is the difference between capital-intensive development and labor-intensive development.
Meaning a dam requires a lot of capital, but not necessarily a lot of people.
Correct. Constructing a hydroelectric dam creates a temporary boom in construction jobs, sure. But once the concrete is poured and the turbines are spinning, it really only takes a highly specialized, relatively small team of engineers to operate it.
That makes sense.
It generates millions of dollars in export revenue, which just balloons the GDP in the industrial percentage. But it does not create a sprawling ecosystem of middle-class jobs. Mining operates on the exact same principle. It relies on heavy machinery, not massive armies of general laborers.
This explains why the macro-level wealth is skyrocketing, but the day-to-day reality for the average worker feels completely disconnected from that wealth. The GDP is transitioning to the modern era, but the workforce is largely left behind in the traditional economy.
And that transition of the workforce is, frankly, infinitely more complex than just signing a contract for a foreign-funded infrastructure project. Moving an entire population from rural agrarian lifestyles into urban, service-based, or manufacturing jobs that takes generations of retraining, urbanization, and deep institutional support.
Which perfectly transitions us to the reality of the Lao worker. Let's look at what the World Bank's synthesis actually reveals about the labor market, because on paper, it looks incredibly robust. The labor force participation rate for ages 15 to 64 consistently stays over 70%.
And usually, a high participation rate is viewed as a very positive indicator. It means people are active, they aren't discouraged and dropping out of the labor pool entirely.
Right, but the quality of that participation is where the alarm bells really start ringing. The metrics classify a massive 76.6% of the workforce in 2022 as being in what they call vulnerable employment.
Yeah, the term vulnerable employment is a specific economic classification that really requires some unpacking. We aren't just talking about jobs that pay poorly. We are talking about the structural nature of the work itself.
Okay, break that down for us.
It encompasses unpaid family workers, so individuals working on a family farm or in a small family enterprise without a formalized salary, and own account workers, which basically means self-employed individuals operating entirely without hired help.
So we're talking about street vendors, subsistence farmers, independent day laborers, maybe motorbike taxi drivers.
Exactly. The defining characteristic of vulnerable employment is the absolute absence of formalized social safety nets. These individuals do not have occupational risk protection.
None at all.
None. There is no paid sick leave, no unemployment insurance, no employer-sponsored health care, and certainly no pension plan. Their daily survival is entirely dictated by the immediate fluctuations of the market, or, in many cases, just the unpredictability of the weather.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and it brings me back to the paradox I mentioned at the very beginning. Everyone is hustling, everyone is working, but 3/4 of the population is walking a tightrope without a net.
That's a good way to put it.
And the disparities within that vulnerability are just stark. The metrics show a massive gender divide here. For women in the workforce, vulnerable employment hit 82.3% in 2022.
Yeah, the gender gap is significant.
And if you look back at specific points in the historical data, self-employment among working women was an astounding 94% at one point.
That 94% figure is incredibly revealing about the societal structure. It indicates that while women are economically active and absolutely essential to the survival of the household, they have historically been heavily locked out of the formal salaried sectors.
Like government administration or corporate roles.
Exactly.
So why is that? Is it purely a lack of educational access in previous generations, or are there deeper cultural mechanisms at play that are keeping women in the informal market?
It's definitely a confluence of factors. Historically, yes, educational disparities played a massive role, limiting access to formal qualifications. But it's also heavily driven by cultural expectations regarding domestic duties and childcare.
Because informal work is more flexible.
Precisely. Informal, self-employed work like running a small market stall or producing handicrafts at home offers the flexibility required to simultaneously manage unpaid care work, which, as in many places, falls disproportionately on women. They are the backbone of the daily, localized market economy, but they are absorbing almost all of the economic risk.
I really want you listening to think about the psychological weight of that kind of economy. What stands out to you about a society where nearly everyone works, but failure doesn't mean filing for bankruptcy? It literally means not being able to feed your family that week.
It changes your entire perspective on risk.
Exactly. It changes how you view that 70% labor participation rate. It's not an indicator of a booming, ambitious job market where everyone's climbing the corporate ladder. It is an indicator of sheer survival.
And from a macroeconomic perspective, having a workforce trapped in low productivity, high vulnerability jobs is the primary bottleneck, preventing a country from escaping the middle-income trap.
You just can't scale that up.
No, you cannot build a modern, high-value service economy or a tech sector with a workforce that is entirely consumed by day-to-day subsistence.
So to break that bottleneck, a nation needs to transition workers from the informal economy into the formal economy. And the only way to do that is by equipping them with skills.
Education is the only bridge.
Right. But if these current workers are stuck in the informal economy, how is the country preparing its next generation to break that cycle? This brings us to the human capital data and what I can only describe as an education paradox.
To quantify this, the World Bank uses what's called the Human Capital Index, or HCI. It measures the amount of human capital that a child born today can expect to attain by age 18, given the risks of poor health and poor education that prevail in the country where they live.
Okay.
For Lao PDR, the HCI score currently sits right around 0.45.
Okay, let's ground that number in reality for a second. An HCI of 0.45 means that a child born in Lao PDR today will only be 45% as productive when they reach adulthood as they could be if they had enjoyed complete education and full health.
That's the exact interpretation.
The country is essentially leaving 55% of its future economic potential on the table.
The ceiling for future economic complexity is being artificially lowered before these kids even grow up. Interestingly, though, the data notes that females score slightly higher on the index at 0.46 compared to males at 0.44.
Oh, that is interesting.
It is, but the overarching reality is that the aggregate human potential is severely constrained across the board.
But here's the paradox I mentioned. When you look at the sheer effort the country has put into expanding education over the last few decades, it looks like a monumental victory.
The enrollment numbers are huge.
They are. Primary gross enrollment is over 100%. Secondary enrollment jumped from a dismal 11% in the 1990s to over 67% in the 2010s. Tertiary, or college-level enrollment, reached over 14%, with massive strides in gender equality. They've built the schools, they've enrolled the kids, the hardware is in place.
The expansion of coverage is undeniable. I mean, getting children into the physical classroom was the primary developmental goal of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and they achieved it. But the researchers point to a severe crisis in the efficiency and the quality of that system. Enrolling a child in first grade simply does not guarantee they will actually learn to read.
Yeah, the data on dropouts is rough. The survival rate to fifth grade, meaning the percentage of kids who start school and actually make it to year 5 without dropping out, only recently improved from 50% to over 80%.
Which means for a long time, half the students were leaving.
Half the kids were just vanishing from the system before they even reached middle school. And the deeper issue is what happens to the kids who actually stay. The academic analysis flags a really critical metric called learning poverty.
Learning poverty is defined as the percentage of 10-year-olds who cannot read and understand a simple age-appropriate text. In Lao PDR, this proportion is exceptionally high.
I want to use an analogy here. It's like trying to build a high-speed rail network. You spend billions laying down the tracks and building these gleaming stations. That's the school buildings and the massive enrollment numbers.
Right.
But you completely neglect to train the train conductors, and you don't provide any electricity to the grid. The trains look great, but they don't actually go anywhere. Why is quality so poor? What are the actual mechanisms causing this massive learning poverty?
It's a combination of severe resource constraints and some very complex demographics. First, you have chronic underfunding of the operational side of education. You might have a physical school building, sure, but you lag trained teachers.
Which leads to overcrowding.
Exactly, resulting in unmanageable pupil-teacher ratios, particularly in rural areas. The ratio might average out to around 22-to-1 nationally on paper, but in remote villages, a single teacher might be handling 50 kids across multiple grade levels simultaneously.
And there's a massive linguistic barrier. Right, I mean, Lao PDR is incredibly ethnically diverse.
Precisely. There are dozens of ethnic groups with their own distinct languages and dialects. Yet the national curriculum is taught entirely in the official Lao language.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so for many rural children, entering first grade means trying to learn basic literacy and math in a language they do not speak at home. This creates an immediate, profound cognitive hurdle that leads directly to those high dropout rates and the high learning poverty.
So transitioning the system from focusing on the quantity of seats to the quality of the instruction is the only way out. I mean, you cannot operate the complex logistics required for modern manufacturing or run a digital service economy if your workforce struggles with basic reading comprehension.
You really can't.
But this human capital deficit isn't just a software problem. It's not just about what is happening in the brain. It's fundamentally a hardware problem. You can't learn if your physical body is compromised.
Which brings us to Section 5, the biological reality of this progress. Human capital and physical health are inextricably linked, and the health data for Lao PDR presents this narrative of staggering, hard-won triumphs existing right alongside deeply entrenched chronic biological threats.
We have to start with the triumphs, though, because they represent the saving of countless lives. The reduction in maternal mortality is one of the most vital indicators of state capacity in this entire report.
It's a massive achievement.
In the 1990s, the maternal mortality ratio was around 1,050 deaths per 100,000 live births. By 2022, model estimates show that has plummeted to roughly 199.
To reduce maternal mortality by that magnitude in a geographically fractured mountainous country requires an immense logistical and societal effort.
How did they actually do it? Because it's not just about, handing out a new medicine.
No, it requires a multi-pronged approach. First, infrastructure. Building paved roads allows pregnant women experiencing complications to actually reach a district hospital, whereas previously, an obstructed labor in a remote village was almost certainly a death sentence.
Just getting there was the battle.
Exactly. Second is the widespread training and deployment of skilled birth attendants and midwives into those rural outposts. And third, overcoming deep-seated traditional birthing practices, encouraging women to seek prenatal care and deliver in clinical settings rather than at home. It is a monumental achievement in public health delivery.
And similarly, the infant mortality rate has steadily dropped, and overall life expectancy has lengthened significantly. The basic biological security of the population has clearly improved. People are surviving birth, and they are living longer.
Yes, but the researchers point out a severe secondary crisis. Surviving is the baseline. Thriving is the goal. And right now, a large part of the population is hitting a biological ceiling.
The most concerning metric in this regard is the rate of childhood stunting. Historically, stunting in children under 5 in Lao PDR was above 40%.
And when we talk about stunting, we need to be crystal clear that we are not just talking about height.
Right, it's not just a cosmetic issue of being short for your age.
Not at all. Stunting is the physical manifestation of chronic, severe malnutrition and repeated infection during the first 1,000 days of a child's life. So that's from conception to age 2.
Which is the most critical window.
Exactly. During this window, the brain requires immense caloric and nutritional density to form neural pathways. If the body is starved of those nutrients, or if it is constantly expending all its energy fighting off waterborne pathogens from bad sanitation, brain development is permanently impaired.
It causes irreversible cognitive deficits.
Completely irreversible. A child who is stunted will perform worse in school, earn less as an adult, and have a much higher risk of chronic disease. When over 40% of your current adult workforce experience stunting in childhood, that directly hardwires the low human capital index we discussed earlier.
The physical capacity of the brain was capped before they even reached a classroom.
Exactly. Furthermore, the data indicates that anemia affects roughly 35% of women of reproductive age.
Which means chronic fatigue, decreased productivity, and higher risks during pregnancy, which just perpetuates the cycle to the next generation. So we have this massive nutritional threat. But the academic analysis also raises an environmental health threat that is, frankly, literally inescapable.
The air quality.
Yes. The annual PM2.5 exposure, that's the microscopic particulate matter that penetrates deep into the lungs and enters the bloodstream, is chronically above 29 micrograms per cubic meter. The researchers state that 100% of the population is exposed to air quality that violates World Health Organization standards.
Every single citizen is breathing compromised air.
We really need to connect the dots here. We spent the first part of our discussion marveling at the engine room, the massive industrialization, the economic growth. Is this severe air pollution simply the unavoidable byproduct of that economic miracle?
It's the ultimate developmental tightrope. It's a paradox where the economic cure creates a new biological disease. Rapid industrialization, road construction, the expansion of the vehicle fleet, these all generate wealth. And that wealth builds the rural clinics that lower the maternal mortality.
Right.
But if that industrialization is poorly regulated, it pumps toxins straight into the air.
And it's not just factories, right? It's agricultural practices as well.
Exactly. Slash and burn agriculture, which is still widely practiced, combined with transboundary haze from neighboring countries engaging in similar practices, creates this toxic soup, especially during the dry season.
A brutal trade-off.
It is. The country is successfully fighting off the diseases of extreme poverty like dysentery and basic infections, only to replace them with the chronic diseases of industrialization, asthma, cardiovascular disease, and lung cancer.
And to manage that tightrope, to regulate the emissions of a new factory without scaring off the foreign investor, or to enforce agricultural fire bans across remote mountainous terrain, a country needs a lot more than just good intentions.
It requires highly functional institutions.
It requires strong governance. Which brings us to Section 6, the operational software of the nation.
We can look at this through the lens of connectivity and governance. From a physical and digital standpoint, Lao PDR is undergoing a digital dawn. A country that was historically defined by geographic isolation, landlocked, and surrounded by much larger economic powers, is actively rewriting the rules of its own geography.
They are transitioning from being landlocked to being land-linked. And the digital infrastructure metrics are wild. Secure internet servers exploded from just a few dozen to thousands post-2010. Air travel passengers peaked at 1.47 million in 2019.
They are physically and digitally plugging into the global matrix.
The physical hardware, the cell towers, the high-speed rail links to China, the hydroelectric grids is booming.
However, a nation's ability to maximize that hardware is entirely dependent on its institutional software. The regulatory frameworks, the efficiency of the bureaucracy, and the predictability of the legal system.
And to analyze that software, the researchers rely on the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI, compiled by the World Bank. Now, before we get into the weeds on these numbers, I want to be explicitly clear with you, the listener.
Yes, very important context.
We are strictly reporting the academic metrics and expert percentiles provided in the source material to understand the macroeconomic business environment. We are not taking a political side, nor are we endorsing any specific viewpoint on Lao PDR's internal affairs. We are simply reading the diagnostic chart as presented by global economists.
Exactly. The WGI is a standardized tool used to measure institutional quality across all nations. It aggregates views on the quality of governance from enterprise, citizen, and expert survey respondents. It uses a standard normal distribution scale, which ranges from roughly -2.5, indicating very weak governance, to positive 2.5, indicating very strong governance.
Okay, so a 0 would be exactly average on the global stage. Let's look at the actual numbers for Lao PDR. The control of corruption percentile showed slow improvement, moving from the 5.8 percentile up to about the 19th percentile.
So it is moving in a positive direction.
It is, but it remains in the bottom quintile globally.
More critical for economic development, though, is the regulatory quality metric, which captures perceptions of the ability of the government to formulate and implement sound policies and regulations that permit and promote private sector development.
How does that score look?
For Lao PDR, this remains in negative territory, ranging from -1.3 to -0.9. Additionally, the rule of law estimate, capturing perceptions of confidence in contract enforcement and property rights, sat around -0.3 for 2022.
Let's translate those negative scores into a real-world scenario. Why does a -1.3 in regulatory quality matter if the country is still successfully attracting billions in foreign direct investment for hydropower?
Because it entirely dictates the type of investment you attract and how much of that investment actually benefits the local population. If you are a multinational mining conglomerate or a state-backed energy firm building a massive dam, you negotiate directly at the highest levels of government.
Right.
You carve out bespoke agreements. You can navigate a negative regulatory environment because your project is a national priority.
You essentially build your own regulatory bubble.
Precisely. But suppose you are a mid-sized global tech manufacturer looking to build a facility to assemble electronics. You need to import thousands of varied components daily. You need clear labor dispute mechanisms. You need to rely on local logistics networks. And you need absolute certainty that your business licenses won't be arbitrarily revoked by a regional bureaucrat.
You don't have the leverage for a bespoke treaty.
Exactly. You cannot negotiate a bespoke treaty for a medium-sized factory. You have to rely on the standard regulatory environment.
And if that environment is characterized by opaque, paper-pushing, overlapping bureaucratic jurisdictions, and unpredictable enforcement, which is what a -1.3 implies, that tech manufacturer will simply build their factory in a neighboring country with a higher WGI score.
Exactly. Weak institutional software repels the exact type of high-value, high-tech, job-creating foreign investment that Lao PDR desperately needs to pull its workforce out of vulnerable employment. It locks the country into relying on basic resource extraction. Upgrading the efficiency, transparency, and digitalization of the bureaucracy is the crucial missing variable for sustainable growth.
And speaking of sustainable growth, we have to talk about the literal ground this transformation is built upon. We've seen the dams built and the forests cleared, but at what cost to the natural assets of the country? The environmental data presents a fascinating and somewhat terrifying inflection point.
Historically, Lao PDR was a global ecological asset. In the 1990s, thanks to its vast, largely untouched forest cover, the total greenhouse gas emissions, including land use and forestry, were negative.
They were a carbon sink.
Yes, they absorbed more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than they produced.
But the recent data shows that era is over. They have flipped. They are now a net positive emitter of greenhouse gases. The data tracking forest rents as a percentage of GDP shows heavy fluctuations, perfectly mirroring the intensity of timber extraction, land clearing for agriculture, and the flooding of massive valleys for hydropower reservoirs.
The natural environment is buckling under unprecedented pressure.
It really is.
Yeah.
Yet we cannot look at the natural environment without also looking at the human environment. This is where the data delivers one of the most profound public health victories in the entire report.
The sanitation data.
The sanitation data. The rate of open defecation dropped dramatically from 61% down to just 8.7%.
We often gloss over sanitation when talking about macroeconomics, but the eradication of open defecation is a monumental upgrade in the baseline quality of human life.
It's massive.
It drastically reduces the transmission of waterborne pathogens like cholera and dysentery, which directly ties back into reducing the childhood stunting we discussed earlier. It improves child mortality, it protects water tables, and frankly, it elevates basic human dignity.
But do you see the massive tension here? The natural environment is being degraded, the forests are shrinking, the carbon sink is gone, the air is thick with PM 2.5. But the human living environment, the actual homes and sanitation facilities, is vastly improving.
Yes.
They are basically trading their ecological wealth for human welfare.
It is the defining trade-off of the industrial age. But Lao PDR is rapidly approaching the absolute carrying capacity of its environment. They have achieved this incredible surge in growth by aggressively extracting natural resources. But that model has an expiration date.
Because eventually the forests are gone and the rivers just can't take another dam.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, a green transition is no longer a Western luxury or a talking point. It is a fundamental economic necessity for Lao PDR. If the air becomes too toxic to attract skilled labor, if deforestation leads to catastrophic flooding that destroys the new highways, and if climate change alters the monsoon patterns that feed the hydroelectric dams, the entire economic engine will seize up.
It all grinds to a halt.
Sustainable development is the only path that doesn't end in an ecological and economic dead end.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. I mean, from a $43 GDP to the digital dawn. From the devastation of childhood stunting to the victory over maternal mortality. When you step back and look at the totality of this academic diagnostic chart, how do you synthesize the overarching narrative of Lao PDR's transformation?
If we synthesize this vast array of data, three distinct pillars emerge. First, we must acknowledge the monumental achievements. Lao PDR has orchestrated high macroeconomic growth, executed a vast and commendable expansion in baseline healthcare and educational coverage, and broken its geographic isolation through vital physical and digital infrastructure. They have built the foundation of a modern state.
But that foundation is currently bearing the weight of immense structural challenges.
Which is the second pillar. The human capital gap is severe, quantified by that 0.45 index. The labor force, while fully employed, is trapped in highly vulnerable, low-value informal work. And the institutional governance, the software of the nation, is struggling to keep pace with the physical hardware, creating bottlenecks for high-quality investment.
So the third pillar has to be the operational path forward. They have to transition their education system from simply counting how many kids are in a room to actually ensuring high-quality, measurable learning. They must streamline their regulatory environment to attract the tech and manufacturing jobs that offer real safety nets. And they have to aggressively pursue green development to protect the very natural resources their economy relies on.
It's a transition from accumulating quantity to demanding quality across every sector of society.
Which leaves me with a final thought, something that isn't explicitly graphed in the World Bank data, but is looming over everything we just discussed. We saw how rapidly Lao PDR adopted the internet, moving from 0 to thousands of servers. They are entering the digital economy.
They are.
But we are currently witnessing the dawn of artificial intelligence and advanced automation technologies that are beginning to consume the very lower tier manufacturing, coding, and service jobs that developing nations traditionally rely on to grow their middle class.
That's a huge variable.
If the old ladder of development moving from the farm to the assembly line to the call center is being automated away, how does a country with a human capital index of 0.45 compete? Will the sheer disruptive force of the digital revolution allow them to somehow leapfrog the old, slow models of industrial development? Or will that entrenched learning poverty trap them on the wrong side of the digital divide before they even get a chance to run the race? It is something for you to ponder.
It is a profound question, and is the defining challenge not just for Lao PDR, but for the entire future of global development.
When we look at the diagnostic landscape of a nation, there are no clean lines. It is murky, it's full of contradictions, booming GDPs, built by vulnerable workers, triumphs in sanitation existing beneath skies choked with particulate matter. It is not binary, but it is the messy, resilient, and undeniable reality of human progress. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time.